Not to get all colonialist and romantic again, but remember that 150-year era that encompassed the conquest and destruction of the Old West? Well, it was a colorful period in American history. Also an awful one, let's just name that. But it's a time in American history marked by wilderness taming, exploration, cowboys, settling, and a lot of dust, it seems. Combine that with a distinct sense of lawlessness, and you've got yourself a recipe for at least one Christmas Eve gunfight, especially if you involve saloons.
Welcome to Margs and Mayhem, where I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, make sure you are of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly.
Hello, everybody. Did you miss me? I suppose my short few weeks sabbatical has been extended somewhat, but I'm certainly glad to be back talking about true crime with you all. I have a delicious holiday-themed episode for today, and if you listen all the way until the end, I have a very exciting and special announcement. Suppose if you don't want to listen all the way until the end, you can just fast forward. All right, we have a cranberry margarita for this holiday-themed episode because, well, it's the holidays, and is it the holidays without cranberry sauce? I don't know, probably. Anyway, we'll start with our drink because, as you know, when we talk about true crime, sometimes we need a little something to take the edge off. So, for this drink, you're going to need cranberry juice, triple sec, tequila, lime juice, and simple syrup to taste. We'll start with our glasses. You'll take your lime and cut it if you haven't. Rub it around your glass and then put salt on the rim of that glass. This is an optional step, but I always highly recommend it. The internet tells me that the salt intensifies the sweet and sour notes in the drink, and it will take away any bitterness from the cranberry juice and the tequila. So I prefer to do sparkling when I can, but I couldn't find sparkling cranberry juice, so I'm going to go ahead and do non-sparkling cranberry juice for this drink. I've been told recently that I apparently like my margaritas pretty strong, so take that with whatever you want to take that with. You're going to do 3 parts cranberry juice. As usual, I say parts because it kind of depends on how big you want your drink, but if you have a shot glass, that's probably the easiest. Once you've taken your 3 parts cranberry juice, you're going to add between a half a part and a full part lime juice. Remember, in order to be a margarita, it's got to have lime juice and it's got to have tequila. This amount that you do in lime juice depends quite a bit on how limey you want it to be. I would start with a half a part, and then if it's not tart enough at the end, you can add more, but it's cranberry juice, so you know what I mean. So we're going to put 2 parts tequila into this drink. I'm not a snob, as usual with my tequila. You can't really taste it anyway. And now for an ingredient that doesn't define a margarita, but I pretty much always have to have it. I'll do 2 parts triple sec. Then we'll shake all of the ingredients up in our shaker and bougie strain into our glass. You can add simple syrup, honey, or agave nectar to taste. If you've used a cranberry juice cocktail or that sparkling cranberry juice, you're probably not going to need to add anything. If you use 100% cranberry juice, I 100% guarantee you're going to need a little bit of simple syrup. So add that in there, and then you've got yourself a fancy themed margarita for today's episode. Mangum, Texas, was a farming and ranching community off State Highway 6 in Eastland County. It was founded in the 1880s and 1890s at the junction of the Eastland, Wichita Falls, and Gulf Railroad and the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. The settlement was named for the Bob Mangum family, who owned the first store in town and operated the post office, which opened in 1899. Hot springs in Mangum gained a reputation as curative, and the water was bottled and shipped throughout Texas. Pete Mangum, the first depot agent for the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, opened the Mangum Water Mineral Company, and Dave Switzer opened the Maurice Mineral Water Company, a hospital and a bathhouse where patients could take hot mineral baths and drink the water. Switzer also operated the Don Carlos Hotel. In 1915, Mangum had a population of 125, a gin, a school, 2 doctors, and several businesses and churches. Railroad towns were condemned for their unimaginative designs from the very beginning. It's probably why pretty much all old Western towns look the same in films. According to one architectural critic, railroad towns were, quote, dropped at random upon the flat and featureless prairies along our western railroads. In the ordinary course of civilization, such characterless sites are not ones to which populations cleave, end quote. Wow, okay. Did not like railroad towns. Got it. In Mangum, at its founding, there was very little. A railroad depot, a store or two, a saloon, of course, a hotel, and that's about it. They were all built in a row of brick buildings constructed right along the railroad tracks. What a characterless sight. I guess that critic was right. To make matters worse, this squalid shantytown was also inhabited by ruffians. Cowboys, to be exact. Cowboys, if you didn't know, were employed by ranchers to herd cattle. They also helped care for horses, repaired fences and buildings, worked cattle drives, and, in some cases, helped establish frontier towns. And they often managed to blow all of their hard-earned cowboy money in the local saloon most nights of the week. They could stay at the hotel, but that really wasn't their game. They weren't likely to rent a room. They instead would sleep in the livery's hay or on the prairie, or if they had a really good night, the town jail. Out on Christmas Eve, 1885, a bit of spirits and some spiked nog, some unfortunately loosened tongues, and, well, there were then some disastrous consequences. It was a Thursday night, and 3 buddies who weren't Mangum locals but were in town for who knows why had gathered at the local saloon. Jack Doyle, Don Sullivan, and Buck Hannon had been drinking most of the evening, naturally. A little bit of whiskey here and there, and most likely some spiked eggnog. Eggnog, which has been around since 1775, by the way, has its own weird history, but that's for another time. Jack, Don, and Buck started trading stories around, as one does. All 3 of them started bragging about their sexual prowess, because of course they did. Joking, jovial, joshing around with each other, laughing and clinking glasses, until, well, it wasn't funny anymore, at least for one of them. You know how it is when everyone's playing around until someone goes a little too far, and then someone isn't laughing anymore suddenly? This is a classic case of that. At some point during the mutual swagger fest, Don started throwing insults around, talking trash, and then he thrust an insult at Jack about, well, Jack's wife, of course. It's always the wife. Jack laughed it off at first, but Don just wouldn't let up. Jack stewed until he just couldn't take it any longer, and it was at that moment that Don boasted that he had also had sex with Jack's wife. Jack thrust himself back from the table, knocking it over, stood up, and cold-cocked Don right in the chin. Oh boy, now he's gone and done it. Jack and Don went after each other for what seemed like hours, but of course was probably only minutes. They were both bloodied and bruised, but they weren't ready to declare a winner yet. So they both drew their revolvers. No classic gun duel here. Oh, and if you're wondering, classic gun duels didn't really happen very often like that in real life, like they did in the movies. What happened next was much more common. Jack was the quickest on the trigger and shot Don right in the head. The ultimate revenge? Don't insult Jack's wife. Got it. Jack, either realizing the error of his ways or wanting to just sleep off the nog, headed back to his hotel room. But have you forgotten? There were 3 friends. Buck, who had just sat and watched his 2 close buddies go, well, postal on each other. Cowboy on each other? Whatever. Well, Buck decided that one dead friend wasn't enough. He followed Jack back to his hotel and crept up to his room. In a misdirected effort to avenge his friend, Buck shot Jack right in the head. Jack didn't even see it coming. Buck, realizing that he needed to, well, get the heck out of Dodge, get the heck out of Mangum, either way, he jumped on his trusty steed and rode as quickly out of town as he could to avoid the hangman's noose. No Western stick-up is complete without that riding off on horseback in the dead of night. Anyway. The following morning on Christmas Day, Jack Doyle and Don Sullivan were both buried in Mangum's cemetery. 2 of the first to be buried there, no doubt. The town of Mangum did not yet have a church, much less a preacher. The citizens of the town gave up some of their Christmas morning to gather around the graves, and they all said silent prayers. Buckhannon was never captured or tried for the murder of Jack Doyle. Knowing the justice of the time, it wouldn't surprise me if he'd gotten away with it either way. Nothing more is known of Old Buck, or if he found a new crew to hang out with, bragging about exploits in a saloon around a round of spiked eggnog. Something that intrigued me about this story as I was researching it was, again, this question of violence in the Wild West. It was wild, after all, right? If you're a fan of old Western movies, you know what I'm talking about. So, how violent was the Wild West? Scholars have suggested that the Old West was not as violent as most movies and books would make it seem. Not as many instances of damsels in distress being tied to the railroad tracks or incompetent sheriffs bungling crimes. However, homicide rates were extraordinarily high in the West, especially by today's standards, and by the standards of the time in the rest of the United States, with, of course, the exception of the Civil War. For example, in Dodge City, Kansas, which was a town very similar to Mangum, Texas, during this time, a person had a 1 in 61 chance of being murdered. In San Francisco at the same time, the rate was 1 in 203. By the way, both of these are really high, but I'd rather have lived in San Francisco than in Dodge City, Kansas, or Mangum for that matter. 1 in 61 versus 1 in 203. All to say, people settled their disagreements with bullets, usually after drinking a bunch, but not always. It was a violent period in history. Let's not even go into the slaughter of the indigenous people and culture during that time. That's a whole nother episode. And what about the characters of our story today? What was their motivation? What's the pathology involved? Well, if you ask me, the guys just fit into the time. They were the products of their time period. Jack Doyle, Don Sullivan, and Buckhannon likely lost whatever empathy they were born with in situations where they had been wronged, and used the form of conflict resolution they were the most comfortable with, since that's all they'd probably ever seen. Mangum, Texas did not stick around for much longer than Jack, Don, and Buck. At its largest, the town only had a registered population of 150, most of whom were folks who worked at the mineral springs businesses there. By the early 1920s, it had begun to decline. Competition was brutal, and more advertised spas siphoned off business. No pun intended. Okay, pun intended. The Great Depression was Mangum's death knell. No extra money for lounging around at the spas, I suppose. Mangum's post office closed in 1929, and by 1936, all that remained of the community was a Baptist church and a few scattered houses. By the late 1980s, Mangum was no longer shown on highway maps. By 2000, the population was listed as 15. It is officially considered a Texas ghost town. Such a ghost town, in fact, that the only building I could find that still exists today is Mangum Baptist Church. The last recorded Old Western gunfight was in 1918 in Arizona, although people solving conflict with guns has, well, never gone away. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoyed this short episode about some mayhem on Christmas Eve. My friends, this is going to be the very last episode of Margs and Mayhem. But don't worry, we're not going away. We're just rebranding. After almost 2 years of stories of murder and mayhem and a themed margarita, well, I've pretty much run out of margarita recipes. But I'm so excited to start to explore different kinds of drinks with you and to give you different cocktails to enjoy. And my friends, I've heard you loud and clear. Not all of you are drinkers. So starting next year, we'll be doing a cocktail and a mocktail for every episode so that even if you don't drink, you can still enjoy right alongside with us. And lastly, I've been doing a lot of research about some of the ethics behind true crime. It's part of the reason why it's taken me so long to come back to recording podcasts, because I'm just not sure what is okay to talk about and what we should be leaving alone. I'm not judging any true crime fans out there. I am one of the biggest true crime fans. But I've had to make some decisions about what I feel comfortable with putting out there in a podcast format. So we're going to be moving to a little more lighthearted fare. And when we do cover murders, they will be older crimes like this one. So starting next year, please keep listening to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. Starting right now, right when this episode is posted, I'm doing a little bit of a competition on my Instagram to help pick out the new branding for Capers and Cocktails. Please head over there right now and vote for the ones that you like the best. We're hitting the ground running in 2023 with some really fun and funny episodes and some delicious things to drink. I hope you'll give it a shot.